So as I said, today we're talking about the Lord's command to take up our cross and follow him. It's a really good opportunity, I think, for us to just review where we've been over the last couple of weeks. So here's a slide where will show us what we've talked about in the last few weeks. Our first one was to keep my commandments. That's the Lord saying this to us, to keep his commands. Then we looked at his recommendation to follow the Old Testament commandments. We can think of the 10 Commandments in particular, and we spoke particularly about the Sabbath on that day. The Lord's command to generosity, and then last week we looked at repentance. So today, when we consider taking up our cross and following him, really in a way it's gone full circle. We're back to keeping the Lord's commandments, but this time we're not only doing what he says, we're walking with him, we are doing as he does. We're asking the question, what would Jesus do? Now we've already learnt the fact that Jesus' commands are not just a nice theory. They're not just the window dressing on Christianity, they are the very essence of it, and that we cannot call ourselves the church unless we are striving to the best of our ability to follow his commands. We must put them into practice. Today, we're going to learn just how difficult that can be. You see, here Jesus is pulling no punches. And if we're not challenged by this particular command, then I have to say, friends, we're not paying attention. See, when Jesus says, carry your cross and follow him, we realise that the cross, which was Jesus' burden, was the very instrument that was used to put him to death. So how does it apply to us today? We've already talked about our hopes and dreams this morning. And I think we live in a time of hope. Just think about all the things you're seeing and hearing around you over the last week or so. We've had a situation where lives have been under threat. We have experienced panic. There's been panic buying going on. But now, after a week or so, we've settled down into a routine. We've got used to this new world order that we're living under. And around the world, as we look at what we've done, we've made some dramatic changes to the way that we live. Things that we could never have imagined might be possible are happening. And we're beginning to look forward. We're beginning to see that there's a hopeful future lies ahead, and we're beginning to sense our capacity to affect real change in our world. So here's just one example. You might recognise this young lady, Greta Thunberg. Several months ago, in addressing the UN and addressing the world, she called for an end to air travel. And you know, at the time, that seemed like a ridiculous ask. Yet, today, there are very few planes in the air. And in fact, I read during the week that some environmental agencies are saying that as a result of that, we are going to see a 10% drop in our greenhouse emissions this year. And that's startling. Something we could never have imagined would take place. So we start thinking, what will life look like when we get through this? I want to share with you my light bulb moment over the last couple of weeks. I've realised that it's very easy for us to respond to life when we have a time of crisis. It's very easy for us to realise that the situation that we are in crisis we don't enjoy. We know what it is we want to get back to, and so then it's very easy to imagine the steps to get back to it. It's much less easy to respond to life, and it's much less easy to put our hopes and dreams in practice in normal life, because in normal life we're comfortable. We have a status quo, and it lulls us into the sense that everything is okay. There's nothing to worry about, no action is required. And it can be very difficult to hold those hopes and dreams, those visions for the future in our mind when that is the case. And it's true of leadership, and it's true of everyday people. Then every crisis we see that great leadership emerges, and we see that great humanity emerges as well. We seem to need these times of crisis for us to make radical change in our lives. I've got a couple of examples for you. Winston Churchill, widely regarded as the greatest British Prime Minister of all time. Now, of course, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister twice in his career. He was Prime Minister, first of all, from 1940 to 1945, during the Second World War, when he was regarded as the great leader of the free world fighting against Nazi Germany and their allies. But he was also Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. Now, if you're like me and you've seen a television series like The Crown, you'll realise that that second time as Prime Minister was not a good one. And here we have that illustration that in times of great crisis, great leadership emerges, but that leadership is a much, much harder deal when times are what we might call normal. We've also seen people rising to the challenge of the recent bushfires. So here, for example, is a Facebook page, group that I joined, which was providing bushfire accommodation in Canberra just before we left Canberra. Of course, you would remember the fires that hit the southeast coast, and many of those seaside towns, which are very familiar to Canberrans, homes were destroyed and livelihoods lost. And the Canberra community really opened their doors and had an influx of thousands and tens of thousands of people, indeed, into those homes just for community, just for a crisis accommodation. And also in our own time, I'm aware of this group, the kindness pandemic, where people are not wanting to hear the bad news all the time, but they're wanting to show that there is good news about, that there is kindness about, that there is great humanity to be celebrated in these very difficult times. So how is it, I ask, that we can wean ourselves off the need for crisis? Well, I think there are two things. I think firstly, we do need a vision of a better future. But then I think we also need to see the crisis of our own normality. You see, in reality, this normal life that we often enjoy is not an unchanging, steady, steadfast thing. It is in actual fact a slow and unconscious decline into crisis. And our greatest need in normal times is to see the crisis that we are in. Jesus says these words, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Let me give you two examples. La Belle Epoque, which means the beautiful era. This is a period of history at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, a time of great prosperity, a time of comfort, and a time of complacency indeed, in which the seeds of the two world wars were planted. A second example is Extinction Rebellion. I wonder if you've heard of this group. On their website we see these words, We are facing an unprecedented global climate emergency. The government has failed to protect us to survive. It's going to take everything we've got. You see, Extinction Rebellion see the world the right way. They see that normal represents a gradual and inexorable decline into destruction. Now, their understanding is an external one, a natural one, but it is an excellent example of how we need to see our own spiritual lives. We need a vision of a brighter future, and we need the absolute conviction of the crisis of normality. You see, that absolute conviction of the crisis of normality is the cross that we are to bear. And the brighter future is following the Lord. Take up my cross, take up your cross, and follow me. It's interesting in the Gospels when Jesus says those words, in both Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel, he says it twice. Here they are. This is the Luke's Gospel, chapter 9 version. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. In New Church understanding, that cross is what Swedenborg terms the proprium. It is our selfhood. And it is in the self that we find our greatest resistance, our greatest inertia. We are our own worst enemies. The reason nothing changes is because I don't want to change. And it is up to us to put in the effort, to pick that selfhood up and to make it move. Now in Luke chapter 9, it's followed with these words, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." You see, our natural tendency is always to put our own needs and desires first, before those of others. And yet the way to salvation, the very means by which we enter heaven, is to do the exact opposite of that tendency. It is to put the needs of others first. And what that does is it recognizes that I have my own needs and I seek to fulfill them, but my most desperate need is actually to serve and to be of use. Now, if we turn to Luke 14, we have some very challenging words here. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now we have a great many difficulties with those words, and in Luke's Gospel they are very harsh. He uses the word hate, where Matthew's Gospel is a little gentler. But let's concentrate on the hate for the moment. What we can see in those words is actually a literal contradiction with the commandments themselves, which say to honour your father and mother. And so the only solution to that, friends, is a deeper understanding of these words. Father and mother in this context represents not the people who raised us, who gave birth to us and brought us up in their homes. This is the father and mother within us. This is our own heredity. This is the ingrained tendencies we have to certain ways of thinking and acting, and those are the tendencies that stand in our way of the goals we claim we cherish. You see, these are challenging words, and they ask you this, very simply: be the change you want to see in the world. Now, it's true of society at large, and it's also true of the church. If I do not change, if you do not change, then nothing changes. So here's my challenge to you for the week. Do you have a vision of hope for the future? I'm sure you all do. I'd encourage you to write it down, spell it out in as much detail as you can muster. Then ask yourself, what is it I must do to bring that to reality? And what is it that I must give up? Not what the government should do, not what my neighbours must do, but what I must do. Then I want you to count the cost. What will it cost you to change? What will you lose? What do you need to let go of? Now, you probably won't find that too hard because your own selfhood will tell you the things that you treasure that you do not wish to let go of. So you'll be able to write those down fairly easily. But then I also want you to ask what it will cost you not to change. What would happen if you did take the easy road of normal life? One way you can do that is to look at your past. Where has your normal life got you to now? And were you then to continue it, if you extrapolate that out, where do you believe you will end up? If nothing changes, where will you go? Where will you be? And then finally, I want you to hear the Lord's words of encouragement. And this comes from Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.